discovered what he,
Sorry, Chris.
okay. So in 1928, earlier in the year, a railroad employee discovered what he thought were the graves of the three soldiers. And then this unleashed a community-wide event that was sponsored by leading figures in the Historical Society and the Daughters of the American Revolution to build a memorial to the three soldiers. They had an event on April 15th, 1928, when they dedicated the monument. And you can see the language that they used. 200 loyal Americans. This was a newspaper account describing the event. 200 loyal Americans attended the ceremonies. There was an emphasis on loyalty, patriotism, and commemoration of the dead soldiers. The plaque doesn't really make a lot of statements about the war. It's really a memorial, and it was thought to be, with the ideas of sacredness that Dr. Tebeau mentioned, because of where this was sited, it had a sacredness about it. The ceremonies were suitably solemn. They concluded with the playing of taps. Now one thing that's interesting about this also is that in this period, you still had some rather elderly veterans of the Civil War, and you also had people who were the sons and daughters of people who had fought in the Civil War, who were in positions of responsibility in society. And you see that in this dedication ceremony. Several of the people that took part in it were the sons or the daughters or the like of grandchildren. One was the president of the University of Arizona at the time, who reportedly had lost his father in the Civil War. So they had a bit more of a solemn tone about it. The last thing to say about this is just that one thing to remember is this was 1928. Arizona had only been a state for 16 years. So there's an element of celebrating the fact that Arizona is a state in the Union. The ceremony was attended by Governor George W.P. Hunt, who was the first governor of Arizona at that time, or he still is. But let's go ahead to moving ahead. Then, by the middle of the century, things had changed quite a bit in Arizona. There was massive population growth in the state. The population had grown from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands. Phoenix and Tucson were getting to be sizable cities. And while the United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, had rather pointedly not been included in the 1928 ceremony, they were included in a new ceremony. It was held in April 1958. This one was led by the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and it was to dedicate a monument to the Confederacy in Arizona. Now this event bear in mind that generations had passed now, so their connection to the actual people was not the same, and they had other concerns. If you look at, it's no coincidence that this monument went up as the civil rights struggle was ongoing. The United Daughters of the Confederacy around this time the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Arizona was adopting resolutions in support of states' rights, for example. And they were active in those things. And you can see that they were trying to act out a sort of an assumed heritage of, or assumed background of what they thought their history was. So, but that element of promotion of white supremacy shouldn't be lost on this. That continued, and this monument would have been within sight of the 1928 monument. And the rather more boisterous nature of this ceremony, where the amphitheater high school band from Tucson played Dixie, and you had people dressed up in Confederate uniforms sort of play acting, is to rather contrast with the 1928 ceremony. So fast forward to 1984.
Chris, I have a quick question that came from the audience, which is, do you know what the flag here on the right is?
The Oh, well, first off, the flag on the left is what is commonly understood to be the Confederate flag. It was really a Confederate battle flag that was carried in in battle by the troops, by the armies. The flag on the right is actually more of a rendering of what was the official flag of the Confederacy from the start of the war, which somewhat resembled the U.S. flag. I understand that they changed and went to the more familiar Confederate flag in part so it wouldn't be confused with the real U.S. flag.
Good, thank you.
So in 1984, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and again in cooperation with the Historical Society a generation ago, put up a new marker. And this marker really goes into depth. Remember how short the 1928 memorial marker was? This one goes into quite a bit of explanation, telling what we would call a lost cause version of the Civil War in Arizona. It's really about making the Confederate soldiers into the heroes of the event. Ironically, what happened was that in 2015, when there was a renovation project going on in Picacho Peak State Park, where these monuments now reside, the 1984 Confederate monument or marker was actually affixed to the old 1928 monument right below the markers to the 3 U.S. soldiers that had been killed there. It really changed the nature of the whole monument quite a bit. And I would consider it to be actually a desecration of that monument, if you look at that. What's happened then since, interestingly, is that just this last June, when I started this paper, this is the way this monument looked when I started doing my research. In June, just to add a postscript to this, someone actually got into the park and removed and stole the United Daughters of the Confederacy flag. So effectively, the memorial was restored to what it was when it was put in 1928 as a memorial to the dead. But I guess what this really leaves us with is that as we look at the memorial landscape in Arizona, sometimes we see things that are what's behind them is really more considerations of race and other concerns that were prevalent with the people at the time they were put up.
Fabulous, Chris. I actually should declare that when Chris began his project on the Civil War monuments, I told him, I can't imagine there are going to be that many interesting Civil War monuments here in Arizona. And it turns out this is one of the most unique stories you'll hear anywhere about any kind of Confederate monument. So just more proof that you should spend all of your time trying to prove your professor wrong. We're going to turn to Aaron Smith right now. And thank you, Chris, very much. I'm going to clap and I hope the audience wave hands or do our little clap signs or whatever people do to thank you, Chris. Aaron is currently a PhD student at the University of Minnesota. Prior to that, she did a master's degree at ASU, and we did our best to keep her, but Minnesota stole her. She's researching the history. Her own work is on German history and the Holocaust. And for us, she researched the history of Japanese American concentration camp memorials as part of the class. So, Erin, thanks for joining us from the cool northern climes.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back. So yeah, if you would go to the first one. As Dr. Tebeau said, I normally study the memorialization process in cultural phenomena like films in dealing with the Holocaust and World War II in Europe. So when we're talking about what do we do in Arizona, I went with something that was sort of tangentially related, which are the 2 Japanese American concentration camp memorials here in the state. When I started looking at them, they appeared to be very different than the other memorials to Japanese American imprisonment, wartime imprisonment, commonly referred to as internment. That's the official language through the War Relocation Authority that was used by President Roosevelt. However, since then, many historians of this topic do refer to it as a concentration camp, understanding that there are levels and changes in that, but it is a camp that has been removed people on basis of a similar trait like being Japanese American, denying them their citizenship and imprisoning them. So that being said, the memorials and the monuments that exist for wartime imprisonment in other states in the Western US are part of the memorial landscape hierarchy. So they're a part of the National Park Service. They are dedicated as national monuments. That does not exist in Arizona, which is something I'll go into in the next slide. And after much wrestling with it, it's not something that should exist with the Arizona ones. So that's sort of the beauty and the difference of the Arizona memorials. They are part of a pattern in not only the United States, but in other countries such as Germany, Poland, South Africa, of reckoning with historical guilt. Some historians like Erica Doss argues that it's also the idea of acknowledging national shame. These monuments do that. They are memorials to the problematic abridgment of citizens' rights and that abuse, and that does acknowledge that, even though these two memorials are not really part of the national conversation around it. They are not part of the structural acknowledgement of it either. They are wholly from the community. And then one of the interesting things in the Arizona memorials, which is the same with the other ones, is that oftentimes they are a memorial to the imprisonment of Japanese Americans, but they're also a memorial to those individuals who, despite their imprisonment, despite their family's imprisonment, still chose to serve in the war. Most commonly, those men who served in the army were sent to Europe. They became what's referred to as the Purple Heart Battalion because they are the most decorated company in World War II, despite their families still being imprisoned. So the photo on this slide is the Poston Camp Memorial Monument. Poston Camp is out by Poston, Arizona, near the Colorado River. And then this memorial, on the next slide, you can go that, Dr. Tebeau, thanks, is the one located at the Gila River Camp. The Gila River Camp was actually two separate camps, the Rivers Camp and the Butte Camp. And this is where the Arizona camps are so distinct from the other ones in that they were placed on native land. The Office of Indian Affairs, the precursor to today's BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, recommended that in Arizona, concentration camps be placed on indigenous land. It was a seizure of sovereign native land to create these camps. The Japanese Americans who were moved to these camps, Gila River was almost entirely individuals brought from California, whereas Poston were the small Japanese community here in Arizona, as well as individuals brought from Oregon and Washington and placed there. Part of the argument was at the Poston camp that they would be able to work on building Arizona's irrigation and claim the Colorado River water for us and not California. And it worked. So Poston actually was such a large camp, it became the third largest city in Arizona during World War II after Phoenix and Tucson. So this issue with Japanese American imprisonment cannot be separated in Arizona from the legacy of settler colonialism against Native Indigenous persons here in our state. You have to reckon with, and you, the general populace, sorry, we have to reckon with the seizure of land the first time, and then that this is a secondary seizure of land yet again by the government for governmental purposes, wherein then other citizens are deposited on native land and forced to try and survive in the Arizona desert. These monuments themselves are still placed either on or near sovereign land. The Gila River Camp Memorial is on the Gila River Indian community's sovereign land. The Poston Memorial is located just off the Colorado River Indian Nation land. However, both of these memorials only work because of the cooperation between the Native nations where the camps were located and the Japanese American community on the West Coast. One of the individuals who is pictured in this picture, that was redundant, Maz Inoshita, was integral in the Japanese American community in working with the Gila River Indian community to ensure yearly cleanups of the monument. Unfortunately, the Gila River Camp Monument is frequently trashed. It has been shot at. Whole pillars have had to be replaced on it. And that I think is emblematic of the fact that there is a shared yet differentiated trauma. You have the issues of the government seizing again land, but then you also have the issues of the abridgment of citizens' rights. And so they're not a part of the national conversation, but they should be a part of the national conversation. They are not a part of the national park system, but they shouldn't be a part of the national park system, really is the I lost my train of thought there. I'm sorry. The decision I sort of arrived at after looking at this, that the two communities that are involved in these memorials are the ones who have the most say in it, who should have the most say in it and have their agency honored, and not whatever I say about them really happen. So yeah, thank you.
So thank you, Erin. That was great. And this too was one of those studies that really kind of opens our eyes, because it recognizes the complexity of where a monument is placed, really shapes the story. And then it helps us understand not just the story of the people whose lives are being memorialized, but the people with whom they're cooperating. So I thank you, Erin, for that. Great job. I'd like to turn now to Tom Beasley. Tom is a graduate student, PhD student, also at Arizona State. He's studying religious and urban history in the United States. And this work comes out of his interest in religious and roadside memorials. And it takes on a really difficult question. What is the role of religion in public monuments and memorials? So Tom.
Yeah, and as I began this project, looking for what to do, and I stumbled across roadside monuments, I just couldn't stop noticing them all of a sudden. And it's really hard to nail them down. What is a roadside monument? Is it, as we see on the rightmost picture, kind of a chapel to which people visit for worship services, etc.? Is it more of the middle picture we see here, where it's kind of statuaries? Both of these, I should say, the right one is by the San Pedro Chapel in Tucson, the middle one, Garden of Gethsemane in Tucson. Or is it like this picture on the leftmost, that's a block from my house, just across in the ground? And so as you begin to think about what we might call roadside monuments or vernacular monuments or ephemeral monuments or vernacular monuments, and none of these terms precisely fit because they can be all of them or none of them, we are forced to expand our understanding of not only what religion is, but maybe what a monument is. Because roadside monuments, on the one hand, they're a regional phenomenon. They're part of a Spanish tradition and Hispanic tradition of last rites. They're a global tradition as well. And so we can find a plurality of functions and types of roadside monuments. But I want to talk about one in particular that I found particularly interesting. As you can see on the next slide here, El Tiradito is a pretty famous roadside shrine in Tucson. It's also called the Wishing Shrine. And I'll briefly go through its history to illustrate the way these shrines can change and the way functions that they can have. And as others have said, the evolutionary role that each of these sites has a history, even if it's unknown, like the first picture we saw, it's just across by my house, they do have a history, and we know someone put them there for a purpose because of the diversity of devotional objects they leave there. So El Tiradito emerged at what we think in the 1870s as a shrine to a sinner. There's at least a dozen different stories or myths associated with this shrine, but all of them involve some kind of tragedy, where a young man tragically died because he was a sinner, he was unfaithful, or he was a murderer, a criminal. He couldn't partake in last rites. Therefore, the local community seems to have constructed a site to remember him, to pray on his behalf. And that's how the shrine existed in one of the oldest neighborhoods of Tucson throughout the 19th century. While once we get an influx of Anglo settlers and they begin street widening processes and they begin to develop the city and kind of claim it as their own, they took notice of this, but they didn't destroy it. They relocated it to a new place. And this is when Tucson historical societies began to adopt myths to draw attention to it, and it kind of became a tourist attraction of sorts. So you not only have a local community that prays at and views it as part of their heritage, you have a new group who is using it as a city landmark of sorts. Well, fast forward about 40 years, it becomes a kind of a cultural symbol. Again, the city of Tucson is undergoing some what we might call urban renewal, and they're destroying acres of neighborhoods for highways and for residential areas, notably in some of the oldest Hispanic communities of the city. Well, the monument becomes a rallying point. It becomes symbolic of the neighborhood, and people begin to advocate, well, you can't destroy this section of ground. It's a historic landmark. And sure enough, they win in the land, and it becomes part of the National Register of Historic Landmarks in 1971. And so again, it's taken on another symbol. It's not just a place where religious people go. It's not just an urban tourist destination. It's kind of broadly symbolic of the Hispanic community in general. Again, fast forward 30 years. During the 1990s, we have political issues surrounding the border flare up. You know, you have immigrants who are coming over and perishing, and this becomes, El Tiradito becomes a site of activism, where people will write names of loved ones they know and hang them on the tree that's next to this shrine. And it will become a place where they not only pray for them, but it becomes kind of a site of civil discourse and political activism. And so why do I go through all of this real quick? Well, first of all, we see that shrines such as this have multi-directional usage. They're not just one use from them. People will come to pray to them. People will come for secular reasons. One kind of funny story I saw was these kids would tell tourists to throw coins at the back and a wish would be granted, and then they'd collect the coins and leave.
I made a mistake. Keep going. Go ahead, Tom.
Great, sorry. A second thing, so we see multi-directional usage. They have multiple simultaneous uses, not necessarily contradictory. Second, we see spatial evolution. As people bring devotional objects or tokens of a loved one to these spots, the space itself changes. Not just the meaning of the space that people bring to it, but physically it changes, not just when it's moved. But for instance, at Easter, you might see a surge of activity here. At the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, you might see an influx. Because in response to a political event, you might see it. A third thing we see is, and Dr. Tebeau mentioned this, sacralization. What makes a space sacred? We see people without approval of any kind of official religious or a state institution claiming a space as their own, regardless of if it's on public or private property, and appropriating it for their own way. And the myth surrounding it and the body that may or may not be there makes the site sacred, makes a place where maybe your wishes can come true. And as the next point says, makes it a space where you can negotiate your own process of grieving, of worship, or of commemoration. And all this speaks to this broader point. These can serve as spaces in which civil and cultural discourse can occur. The monumental landscape doesn't seem to provide something that speaks to your values or to your community. People will formulate their own and establish it. So that's why I encourage you, look for these monuments. You'll start finding them anywhere. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. That's great. The thing I learned from yours is I had no idea there were as many interesting vernacular monuments in Arizona, and then the connections to broader religious monuments are also interesting. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that in our Q&A later on. So thank you so much, Tom. Yeah. I'd now like to turn to Caitlin Burnham. Caitlin is a recent master's graduate of Arizona State, and for her research, her master's thesis, she wrote a history of the Wesley Bolin Memorial Plaza at the Phoenix Capitol and many of the monuments along the plaza, including the story of the USS Arizona, which is really the anchor of it. And it is a phenomenal story, and I learned so much from you, Caitlin. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I did my thesis, like Dr. Tebeau said, on the Wesley Bolin Memorial Plaza. And so this is just a little park located across the street from the Arizona State Capitol that hosts like 25 different monuments, different things that are built for Arizona's history. And so I'm just going to touch on a few things as I talk about the World War II memorial, all the pieces that make that up here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how they are a living memorial, how it's one that the public continues to interact with, and also how the use of artifacts from a specific historical event really create a sacred space that when visitors come, it can be a really meaningful experience for them. And then talk a little bit about the symbolism found in each of these pieces. So you can go ahead to the next slide. We're going to start with the anchor. So like Dr. Tebeau said, this really is the anchor of the plaza. The anchor is from the USS Arizona. After it sank, the anchor was taken by the Navy, and in 1972, the Navy gifted it back to the state of Arizona. And in 1976, it was dedicated on the 35th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it was the first memorial to be placed in this newly created Wesley Memorial Plaza. And it was placed on the far end of the plaza, and it really became the focal point of the plaza and created this landscape where monuments would continue to be added over the years and are continued to be added today. And so the anchor really shaped what the plaza was going to become. And so the anchor itself weighs about 10 tons. The chain itself is 1 ton, and it sits atop this circular drum-like base. And the names of all those who lost their lives on the USS Arizona on the attack on Pearl Harbor are listed there. And this anchor and how it sits on the circular drum, and it's got the little water fountain in front of it, it's based on there's another anchor at Pearl Harbor, and that Pearl Harbor Memorial in Pearl Harbor has an anchor that sits on a drum-like base like this. And so it's interesting, and you'll see this in a lot of states, their memorials are based on, they're all kind of follow these same themes. A lot of 9/11 memorials follow the same themes, and Vietnam Veterans Memorial follow the same themes. And it's the same with the case of the USS Arizona anchor. And so another neat thing, Dr. Tebeau earlier talked about the seal that's located inside the rotunda of the state capitol. So from the seal inside the state capitol to this anchor is 1,100 feet. And so it's a foot for each person who lost their life aboard the USS Arizona. And so that's just a cool piece of symbolism. When you stand at the anchor and you look, you can see that tiny copper dome in the distance. That distance, each foot is a life lost on the USS Arizona. And there's little bits of symbolism like this built into the entire memorial, and it's just really neat. And so we can move on to the next slide. So here you're going to see in the background the signal mast. So the signal mast was placed in the plaza in 1990. And since it's the highest point of the ship, it was part of the superstructure that didn't sink with the USS Arizona. It was poking above the water. And so it was removed shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And the chief of naval operations sent it to a naval armory that his friend was commander of in Ohio. And that mast was kept there for training purposes and modified over the years. And then a professor from Arizona actually was visiting his daughter in Ohio and found out the mast was being stored close by after it wasn't being used for training purposes anymore. And he decided he wanted to get this signal mast back to Arizona and make it into a memorial. So he formed the USS Arizona Signal Mast Committee, and they raised money and purchased the mast and transported it to the Wesley Bowl Memorial Plaza in 1990, where they dedicated it, and they still have flag raisings there. Whenever they have ceremonies, they have flyovers and they fly over that signal mast. And so the addition of the signal mast really provided Arizonans with another relic of history that, along with the anchor, really gave Arizona a physical attachment to this historic and national event, and really helped, give Arizona its place in this, national event. So these relics really make it a sacred space. When I've gone there and toured with fourth grade classes a couple times, and every time you tell the fourth graders, this anchor was on the USS Arizona, or this signal mast was on the USS Arizona, their eyes get huge and they're like, this one, and it's really neat for them to see that piece of history. It becomes more real to them. And then the third one is these gun barrels here. So we can stay on this picture, but in 2013, the Secretary of State, Ken Bennett, he heard that a 14-inch gun from the USS Arizona and a 16-inch gun from the USS Missouri were going to be sold for scrap metal. And he wanted to obtain these two artifacts to create a World War II memorial that was comprehensive to all the Arizonans who served in the war. He wanted these to stand as like two bookends of the war. And the gun barrels are significant because the one that was aboard the USS Arizona marks the beginning of World War II, and the USS Missouri gun barrel marks the end of World War II, because USS Missouri was where the Japanese surrendered. And so he was able to obtain these two gun barrels to be these bookends that represent the beginning and the end of the war, and create this memorial. And this one has a lot of symbolism. So there's these 9 blue steel pillars, and they list the names of all the 1,902 Arizona men and women from all branches of the military who died during World War II. And there's 9 sets of blue pillars to represent the 9 minutes that it took for the USS Arizona to sink after it was bombed. And then if you can see tiny in the background there under the gun on the right, the concrete turns a little bit white here. There's some limestone. So from the USS Arizona to the USS Missouri, there's this 400-inch limestone horizontal marker in the concrete, and it's divided into these 1-inch increments, and each inch represents 1,000 military lives, which together symbolizes the more than 400,000 United States servicemen and women who died during World War II. And so it's not just a monument for Arizona, it also includes some symbolism of all those from the United States who died in the war. And so you stand there on that limestone marker and you see this tiny inch and you think about how it represents 1,000 lives. And it's quite sobering. And that's something that I had been to the Wesley Bowl Plaza probably a dozen times before I noticed that and wondered what it was. And then in my research, when I found that, it makes you wish that the monuments and memorials had some more explanation there so that every visitor could know that little piece of symbolism, because it just makes it that much more meaningful. And then there's also markers if you stand at the flagpole behind the anchor, you can look at different memorials and you'll see how long the USS Arizona was and the USS Missouri. So just a lot of really neat symbolism here. And then finally, you can go to the next one. Each year, there's the annual Pearl Harbor Day ceremony. And veterans, it used to just, when it was first dedicated, a lot of World War II veterans and their families attended. But now they have veterans from all wars, and families of veterans even who have died come every single year to this ceremony, and there's speakers and there's a band and there's a flyover, and dozens and dozens of wreaths are laid at this memorial. And it's really become a place where veterans and their families can come and, you know, honor their loved ones and remember the sacrifices that were made. And in this way, interacting with these monuments and memorials is another way that it really becomes a sacred site for those who have connections to it, and for those of us who don't have much connection other than we live in the United States and we live in the state of Arizona. But you still go there, and there's, you know, there's a feeling there that's really neat when you look at the anchor and you look at the gun barrels and you look at the signal mast and you're sitting there with veterans. It just makes, and so this World War II memorial, made up of all these different parts, has really made the landscape, the whole Wesley Bowl Memorial Plaza, a sacred place. And that's it for me.
Hey, thank you so much, Caitlin. The one thing that I learned from you that I did not know wasn't just the history of the USS Arizona, but how the Arizona and its story has evolved over time. Even the creation of the National Memorial didn't happen immediately after the war. It took 10 or 15 years for that to be fully developed. So again, it's part of this longer process and stories about how these spaces develop and change over time. So thank you very much. Thank you, Caitlin. I want to now turn to Carolyn Evans. Carolyn's a doctoral candidate at Arizona State. She's a historian of women, gender, and sexuality. And she went out and asked a really important question, which is there LGBTQ history in the monumental landscape? So Carolyn, I'm going to turn on your camera and get started.
Hello. So my name is Carolyn Evans, and I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about LGBTQ historic preservation in Arizona. So like many LGBTQ histories, or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning histories, my work here tonight begins with the story of a gay bar. And if we could go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is an image of the 307 plaque, a historical plaque and monument that remembers the location of one of Phoenix's earliest gay bars. First called Roy's Buffet in the 1930s, Roy's rebranded itself to the 307 Buffet, a nod to its location at 307 East Roosevelt Street sometime in the 1940s or 1950s. Between the 1950s and 1970s, the bar relocated to 222 East Roosevelt Street and rebranded itself again, this time as the 307 Lounge. The 307 became a fixture in a neighborhood known as the Fruit Loop, which was a small-scale gayborhood, or kind of neighborhood defined by its LGBTQ population or for having a number of LGBTQ businesses. So it was this fixture in this small-scale gayborhood stretching from Roosevelt to Portland Street between 1st and 3rd Street. Valley historian Marshall Shore describes the 307 as a featured destination among Phoenix's most famous drag performers. But beyond drag, the bar was actually home to a unique piece of Arizona art history that predated its LGBTQ ownership. Famous Arizona muralist Ted DeGrazia had once been a loyal patron of the 307 location and supposedly painted the interior walls in the 1950s as part of a trade with the previous owners for discounted drinks. And if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So as this photo makes clear, the 307 building is no longer there. So this is a photo standing a few feet away. You can kind of see the plaque there near the base of the light pole. So back in 2000, the owners of the 307 cited a variety of problems and closed their doors with the promise to relocate and reopen. But the 307 never opened again. The old building briefly housed other businesses, but eventually it was purchased, and there was a plan to demolish the old building in order to build luxury apartments. There were a lot of pleas about the storied history of the bar and the priceless murals inside, but ultimately the company moved forward, Barron Properties moved forward with plans demolishing the building in 2015. If we can go to the next slide. So in this picture, we're looking at the 307 plaque probably 20 or 30 feet away. You can see its outline next to between kind of this umbrella and the light pole. There's almost kind of, yeah, exactly. The demolition of the 307 was bittersweet because the 307 in its original building with DeGrazia murals met a lot of the requirements to become recognized as a historic property. That it was demolished represents a tremendous loss of LGBTQ history in Arizona. However, the demolition of the 307 lit the fuse for LGBTQ historic preservation efforts in Arizona. In 2015, historian Marshall Shore joined forces with Arizona State University's B.J. Budd Memorial Archives and Phoenix Pride to start the Arizona LGBT+ History Project, a collaboration meant to document and preserve LGBTQ life in Arizona. One of the very first goals was to create a plaque to commemorate where the 307 once stood. And in 2017, Barron Properties, which originally demolished and built the apartment buildings, became a partner and donated a private plaque to be placed at 222 East Roosevelt Street, just outside of the new complex. And this was the first of several new efforts in Arizona to document LGBTQ history in the state. And if we can go to the next slide. So the commemoration of the 307 comes at a really exciting moment in national LGBTQ historic preservation efforts. So this photo here is the Gay Liberation Monument, which is a monument commemorating the Stonewall riots and the beginning of the gay liberation movement. The monument was created in the 1980s, but the Stonewall Inn did not become a National Historic Landmark and the first LGBTQ National Historic Landmark until 2016. Gay history, LGBTQ history, is not itself new. So why was it that the first LGBTQ historic landmark wasn't designated until 2016? And why is it that out of the nearly 94,000 sites on the National Register of Historic Places, only a dozen or so are listed due to their primary association with LGBTQ history? Well, that's because structurally, LGBTQ properties have often struggled to become recognized, and that's for a lot of reasons. Because a significant portion of LGBTQ activism happened in the last 50 years. It doesn't often meet the 50-year rule. Because LGBTQ spaces tend to be more secretive or ephemeral due to discrimination or stigma. And because LGBTQ history is sometimes, even now, still treated as taboo, LGBTQ sites are often invisible during preservation or monument efforts. But recognizing these structural problems, the National Park Service launched the LGBTQ Heritage Initiative in 2014 and created grant opportunities for underrepresented communities, such as LGBTQ communities. In 2016, the National Park Service also published this, it's like over 1,000-page long theme study of LGBTQ heritage in the United States, making a number of recommendations about the way forward for such projects. And these national efforts bring a lot of excitement and funding and support, both for big national projects as well as for local LGBTQ heritage efforts. And then if we can go to the final slide. So while national efforts represent new opportunities for growth, both national LGBTQ heritage efforts and local efforts here in Phoenix are not without challenges. So in Arizona, LGBTQ preservation or monument efforts are going to inevitably lead to some difficult conversations, whether that's a question about why we should be preserving LGBTQ history or conversations about backlash, or whether that's having interesting conversations about what does an LGBTQ monument even look like? What does that design look like? These conversations are going to be tough and represent growing pains. However, if we avoid the challenging conversations now, we risk permanently losing this history. Facing the ever-looming threat of gentrification and a newly pending economic recession, community members and public historians alike must continue to advocate for LGBTQ spaces in Phoenix. There are a lot of national examples we can look to for inspiration, But the best way to honor kind of the legacy of the 307 is to take part in these preservation efforts and to ensure that we save this history in the state of Arizona.
Hey, thank you, Carolyn. I learned so much from your work about silences, right? The things we don't normally see in the landscape, and how much work it takes to bring them to life as monuments and memorials, to start those conversations. So thank you very much. All right, and now I am going to turn to Laura Key, and Laura, if you could talk to us about John Greenway. And Laura, I'm going to give you a bio. I'm going to start your video here. Yeah, you should be able to start your video now. And Laura received her PhD from the University of Arizona with a focus on 20th century history of the American West, military history, and Mexican American history. Dr. Key is the lead curator at the Arizona History Museum and associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History. She is currently working on a manuscript tentatively titled Performing Patriotism: How Mexican American Identity, Culture, and Gender Forged Civil Rights in the World War II and Beyond.
Thank you, Dr. Tebeau. I'm really pleased to be here with all of these great scholars. So this is quite a treat for me. And you can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about a little bit different one. This one is actually a statue of a person, the John Greenway statue that you see here. But before we get to the John Greenway statue, and this one is actually at AHS, we're going to talk a little bit about John Greenway and how the Greenway statue has a longer history than this particular casting. Go ahead and advance. John Greenway was one of the most powerful men in Arizona at the turn of the 20th century. He worked for some of Arizona's largest mining companies, including being the general manager of the Calumet and Arizona Copper Company in Bisbee, and the New Cornelio Copper Company, or the NCCC, in Arizona. Greenway and NCCC actually developed the Ajo town site, and he was instrumental in the design of these large man-made caverns that housed pumps and lines that brought water to the mine. His work allowed for a large-scale mining in Ajo and really kind of created this mining town that put Ajo on the map, per se. He was an engineer. He had a PhD. He was very educated, military hero, as you can see from this picture. But he also represents kind of a controversial point in history, in Arizona history. As general manager of Calumet and Arizona Copper Company, he helped organize the infamous Bisbee deportation in 1917, when miners, many of whom were Mexican and immigrants, organized a strike for better wages. Greenway and other mine managers facilitated and advocated for the removal and deportation of over 1,100 miners. Greenway used his position to argue that those striking miners were guilty of treason, even though those miners faced unsafe work conditions. They were underpaid, underappreciated, really, and really made the mining possible for the Bisbee area. His role in the Bisbee deportation marred his stellar reputation, and it actually led to a federal indictment in which charges were dropped many years later. He was actually served the indictment when he was serving in World War I. But even though the indictment never went forward, it kind of marred his political career. He would have had, most likely, a prominent political career, but when he returned, he just continued with his business, and he died not too long afterwards. So how did AHS get this statue of John Greenway? And really it starts with Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. Mark, if you could go one slide, please. Every state in the United States chooses two statues to display in the Capitol. Some in Statuary Hall, but now there are so many that it's kind of taken over the rotunda there. And as soon as the announcement's made, Arizona became a state, they were working on, getting two statues. Greenway's wife, Isabella, campaigned hard to have her husband represented in the Capitol. She appealed to and worked with various veterans groups, including the United Spanish War veterans, in which John Greenway had served during the war as a Rough Rider, the Disabled Veterans of America, and the American Legion. So big-time veterans groups. Isabella was a fierce politician, and she campaigned for including him in the Capitol. And in her campaigning, she had to counter his association and reputation in response to the Bisbee deportation. However, she was successful, and in 1927, Arizona lawmakers adopted a resolution to place a statue of Greenway at the Capitol. And in 1930, the bronze statue of John Campbell Greenway was dedicated and installed in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. And that's the picture that you see on the right there with the flowers, the American flag. The symbolism really couldn't be any more apparent in this. Isabella actually chose or picked the sculptor for her husband, as she visited many to see who would be the best fit. And she actually picked Gutzon Borglum, if that name, and I never know if I'm actually pronouncing that correctly. But you might know him from, he's the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. He also has a troubled history. He was one of the very first artists to work on Stone Mountain in Georgia, and actually worked with the KKK in designing and doing the initial sculpting of the relief at Stone Mountain. He didn't finish it because he had, quote, creative differences, and his work was kind of wiped away, but his association with white supremacist groups and KKK also kind of marred the sculptors' association. All right, next slide, please, Mark. So Greenway and Father Kino represented Arizona in Statuary Hall until 2015, when the statue of Barry Goldwater replaced the Greenway statue. The original statue that you see here in this picture was relocated to the lobby of the Polly Rosenbaum Archives and History Building in Phoenix. For all of the graduate students or historians, you might have done research there and walked in that lobby and seen that, and now you know who he is. You can also see behind the statue the large photograph of Borglum sculpting the statue. Next slide, please. Which leads us to the Greenway statue in front of Arizona Historical Society. This is actually the second casting of the original by Borglum. In 1974, Greenway's son, Jack, donated $50,000 to the Arizona Historical Society in order to erect a memorial to his father. Included is the landscape that you see there. It might have looked a little bit different in 1974, but overall, he kind of designed the landscape also. The question, though, is really why any statue of Greenway? Even during the discussion in 1927 about Statuary Hall, Arizona representatives questioned why Greenway should receive such an honor. In reality, Greenway had only lived in Arizona for about 15 years. His war service was impressive, serving in the Spanish-American War and World War I. But the detractors sought to have Frank Luke from Luke Air Force Base, the World War I aviator who was killed, or Marcus Smith, who worked so hard to get Arizona statehood. Really, though, it was the formidable character of Isabella who was the driving force behind Greenway's statue, which kind of explains their son's desire to have a second casting of his father displayed at the Historical Society. It's located near the University of Arizona, in which Greenway was a regent. There's a lot of foot traffic, and that the historical significance of being at the Historical Society. For me, as a historian, the Greenway statue is curious, and again lends itself to think about who we choose to memorialize and dedicate. In researching the history of this statue, I come back to why Greenway? Much like Arizona representatives, I wonder why he was chosen and not Luke or Smith. And what I've come up with is that it's kind of a sign of the times in the 1920s. He was an incredibly important capitalist, right? He was also one of those of make your way in the West. His position in the mining industry, he held a lot of power, a lot of influence. The choice of Greenway at the Statuary Hall definitely speaks to the roaring 20s with the boom of capitalism and big business, not knowing that in a few years, obviously, the United States would be in the depths of the Great Depression. But I think it's very much a sign of the times. Next slide, please, Mark. I come up with a lot of what ifs. What if the statue project had been delayed for 5 to 10 years? Would Isabella Greenway be the one represented on the nation's capital? Isabella was a force in Arizona politics, and she became the first female representative elected in March 1933. In her time in Congress, she fought for workers' rights, including miners and industrial workers, to get them safety or injured benefits. And she worked tirelessly on compensating veterans, specifically disabled veterans. She was also a very important businesswoman and entrepreneur. When John died in 1927, Isabella moved to Tucson, where she founded the Arizona Hut, a factory that employed convalescent veterans so that they could earn their own living and make their own money to restore some of their, what they perceived as masculinity and their whole self. She also started the successful resort, the Arizona Inn here in Tucson. So why isn't Isabella in front of AHS? And it could be, that it was much cheaper to do a recast of John Greenway because they already had it. Or does it talk to our ideas of gendered remembering of monuments and what monuments are supposed to be, who is memorialized? What's interesting is that AHS holds Isabella Greenway's papers, and I encourage anybody to come and look at them. They are fascinating. And she is a fascinating woman with her own sometimes problematic history, but and that's why we're historians, right? We like to dig into the little known stuff and find out what really happened and what interests us. So thank you very much, Mark. Oh, you're muted, Mark.
When we were planning, thanks so much, Laura. That's fabulous. When we were planning this, I actually was under the impression that Greenway out in front of AHS was the one from Statuary Hall. So I did not know that. But I mean, it raises this great question about who we memorialize and who we don't. What are the silences? And so one of the questions I just threw out in the chat is as maybe a way to get us started. And Janie's been creating some fabulous questions that we're going to start asking. I'm going to start your video, Janie, so you can help me ask questions. We'll start asking our panelists and thinking about with you for the next few minutes. So Janie, where do you want to start that?
Oh gosh, there are a couple. I think a lot of the questions about where monuments fit in our society are really important, especially with a lot of thinking about, well, where do monuments go, right? I think when there was a lot of talk of removing certain monuments, a lot of fingers pointed at the Historical Society and said, oh, do you want this? So what if we start there? So who gets to decide who removes memorials? And then once they're removed and removed from that context, where do they go?
Great question. Who wants to take that? Chris or Caitlin?
I'll go ahead and answer that second part of the question. At least one of the memorials at the Arizona State Capitol, Wesley Bolton Plaza, was recently removed, and it was given back to the group that donated it. And I know that's not always the case. A lot of monuments are, being taken down right now. There's a lot of discussion about whether that's right or wrong. Another option could be providing more interpretation to those monuments. Because every monument has kind of two phases of history: the history of what it claims to be memorializing, and then the history of the era that it was erected in, and the history of why people are erecting it, And so sometimes just added interpretation is needed to help us understand why it was erected, and whether we agree with why it was or not. That is one option that I've come across that could happen. But when they are removed, often they're given back to who donated them, or if they're just the state's property, they just go there.
Yeah. What, Chris? How talk, if you could give a quick answer to that, and then I'll elaborate just a little bit.
Well, I think sometimes the monuments are in themselves represent a history because of why they were put up. So if, Confederate monuments have been talked about a lot. One idea has been to put them in a museum with an interpretation. And as Caitlin mentioned, another thought has been to try to reinterpret them as well. Those tend to be coming down, but I think you have to consider there's a lot of different things. It's not a black and white either or question. We might look back at a particular monument today. We might decide that the person or the thing that was being memorialized isn't quite as important to us as it used to be. That doesn't demand that we take it down, however, just because it's perhaps not as meaningful to us as it was to the people in the past. But that contrasts with a monument that actually represents something that society as a whole now rejects. And so that leads to different decisions. I think they all have to be considered individually on their own merits, and we have to decide what we think of people historically. The American Historical Association talks about monuments as things that we decide are worthy of public honor. So that's, I think, the ultimate question is, when we look at these different monuments and memorials that are out there, which ones are worthy of public honor today, and in what way should we honor them?
Yeah, so I think that's a great answer. The other thing I'd just remind everyone is that the notion that monuments in the present era are somehow the subject of being victimized by rioters really misunderstands that monuments have always been targeted by in politics. In Central Europe, in the former Soviet Union, communist statues were torn down in large numbers after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not the Berlin Wall itself is torn down, not by some formal government agency, but by the people, right? And then resold as tchotchkes. So the idea that that monuments somehow exist outside of this ecosystem is just incorrect. In Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek ruled with an iron hand for 30, 40 years. When he died and his political party fell out of power, the question was, what do we do with all these monuments to Chiang? And they were relocated to his mausoleum. But ironically, the mausoleum has become a site for right-wing organizations. So these are lots of complex stories around the globe. And that's what historians try to do in these debates quite often, is just elaborate on our understandings of the context, right? And inform our present discussions. So Janie, where do you think we should go next?
Well, I think that this question came up related to Aaron's presentation, but I think that it slots in nicely with this conversation we're having here. And Aaron, if you want to give first comment, generally, how much say do you think communities have in the monuments that are placed within their space? And is thinking about community consensus going to be how we go forward in answering that question? Well, what do we do with all these memorials that we might or might not want anymore?
Yeah, absolutely. I think community consensus and understanding the community in which a memorial or a monument is being placed is going to be and has previously been very important. In the case of the two camp memorials here in Arizona, the reason why Poston is not on sovereign land anymore is because of the agreement between the Japanese American community and the Colorado River community, that they said, no, we'd rather you didn't put a monument on our land again. Whereas the agreement between the JACL here in Phoenix, or not here, virtual here. Anyways, the JACL in Phoenix and the Gila River Indian community is that the two of them got together and agreed that building a memorial to the camps to wartime service was an important thing to have in that space. And so it was made by joint agreement. And it is still something that is jointly worked on every year. You cannot go access it really without talking to individuals who sort of hold the protection of the monument. So I think being able to have the community have their say in what gets put up next to them is paramount in a way, because if you're putting up something that continues to foster unrest or continues to push painful memories on a community, why would we want to do that?
Well, and it really is interesting, Aaron, in parks throughout the United States, you'll have immigrant groups from the teens and 20s memorializing figures as a way to tell a story about identity, right? But neighborhood succession, and much like Tom's story, and I'm curious, Tom, how people informally change memorials, you'll have the new residents of the neighborhood surrounding the park want to replace Leif Erikson or Columbus with somebody else that represents their history. So you have these new debates emerge, and what do we do with the old monuments in that case? Tom, how do the religious monuments talk about this informal process of communities making decisions?
Yeah, and I think the chat and this conversation reflects this, is we're asking, who do monuments represent and who gets to decide how they function, who they are? And in the case of a lot of these in more informal religious monuments, it's kind of an autonomous, dare I say, egalitarian process where you want to bring an object, feel free to do it. Now, the flip side of that is we see vandalism can happen a lot, and we can see who gets to control that space being really difficult. So like in Arizona, for instance, Arizona has recently decided you're allowed to put up a cross or something to commemorate a tragedy on their side, but you have to register it with the Department of Transportation. But what if it's in private space? What if it's in the establishment clause? And so there's all these complicated issues. But the broader point is community is always multiple. It's always multi-directional. And that doesn't mean it's contradictory to one another or mutually exclusive. But there's always going to be an evolution in that process.
That's fabulous. Janie, do we want to continue this or we want to go somewhere else?
Does anyone else have any other thoughts?
Laura?
I can't cover it better than they did, so.
Okay. Yeah, why don't we move to another question? Do you have one in mind, Janie?
I like this question that just came in. And it's kind of, how do monuments end up becoming public? Thinking about, not only kind of thinking about following the money, so to speak. So if my family pays for a statue, is that a public monument or is that a statue that we've paid for? And when does that narrative change?
Wow, who wants to take up that one? Laura, you haven't said anything. Do you want to take up, I mean, you talked a lot about this. How did Greenway become public in representing Arizona? Who paid for these and that sort of thing?
Right, like, so for Statuary Hall, right, although, you know, the state did contribute money, Isabella really was instrumental in getting the veterans, to his fellow veterans, right, to donate money to Canvas. And you know, I can't remember the actual breakdown of the money, but you know, it's public, private, and public. And this one's a little different because it does go on, you know, basically federal property, right? So that, you know, I would be curious of the discussion of when they removed that, to the decision to put it in the state archives. Is it like a historical piece now that is, it's less than a monument or a memorial, but now it has historical value because it was in, you know, the federal and the Capitol building. So really it's the public. So, you know, the archives in Phoenix seems to be a natural place for that to be. For the AHS one, right, this is through a private donation, but on state property. This is where it gets muddled, right? Like this is where, you know, is it public and is it private there? That, you know, there was a quid pro quo there. And obviously long before any of us were here at AHS, would things be different today? Would Greenway statue, you know, would somebody come up and say, hey, I'll give you $50,000 if you put a statue of my dad up there, right? And again, this is a little bit different too, because Greenway, that's a casting of that statue, was in the Capitol building. So is it historic in that way? Is it because it represents a historical thing that Arizona did as a state in the federal government? Is it represented here? I don't know if Jack thought of it that way. I'm honestly more interested in, you know, I would love to find out why not his mom, right? But, you know, that could be just my own biases. So I don't think I have an answer for that, but it sure is complicated when you have private funding on state or federal property. It's, you know, who does that monument belong to, and who is representing that monument? And I think that's where the trouble comes from.
And Carolyn, you had a really interesting funding story for those plaques, for that plaque.
Yeah, so the 307 plaque was actually donated by Barron Properties, which is the same actor who bulldozed, who demolished this building in the first place. And the story of monuments, I think, is really interesting here because if you take a step back and you kind of look at the National Register, or even looking at local registers, you might think like, well, where is an LGBTQ monument in Phoenix? Are there LGBTQ monuments in Phoenix? I don't see them. But then if you start to expand what we think about as monuments to things that are privately funded, to things like rainbow crosswalks or kind of this plaque on East Roosevelt Street, or more kind of like informal community monuments, all of a sudden that number increases greatly. And I think, you know, when I first started this research and we were talking about the funding for the plaque, I kind of had some conflicted feelings about it, but I think something that is really unique and really neat is when we kind of expand thinking about these community partnerships in terms of where are we placing plaques, who are we working with to fund plaques, who is involved in creating a marker, creating a monument, that really opens up the ability to have kind of community control over a monument. It opens up the ability to have, I guess, a more responsive process in talking about how monuments are placed and what they remember. And I think that was a really challenging aspect of talking about the 307 historical marker for me, is thinking about this question of funding, and both what are some of the challenges that private funding pose, but also does that open up new opportunities for maybe memorials on a subject that typically isn't memorialized at all. And so that's a really complicated question.
Yeah, and the only thing I'm going to add about it before turning over to Janie for a last question is the other issue is not just who funds it, but then who maintains it, right? One of the reasons monuments are often given to public entities is the expectation that the people who created them isn't just they want to express their social and political power. They don't want the burden of maintaining those monuments, right? And somebody has to do it. And those costs are not insignificant. So Janie, you get to choose the final question we answer before signing off.
Oh gosh, there are two questions that I really like, and I'm going to try to see if I can mush them together. So pardon me if it's not the most graceful question. But there was a question that came up a little earlier about, and it was specifically directed to one of the panelists, but I think it's worth exploring a little bit. How do we add additional interpretation to monuments, right? Is it you know, we work with our local city governments to, you know, create audio tours that people can access for free? Do we put up additional plaques? Do we recontextualize the monument? And then kind of related, someone had asked a question of, is there a census of monuments? How many monuments are depict male historical figures versus female historical figures? And I'd like to complicate that binary a little bit by saying, how do we depict people who exist outside of the male-female binary, or people whose gender representation is in flux given changes to the historical narrative. So my namesake, Jane Addams, there's been a lot of work done on her experiences as a queer woman. How does memorialization at the Hull House change when we think about Jane Addams as a queer woman?
Wow. So I don't know who we're going to give that last, but I will only say that I do believe in the early 60s, somebody at the Arizona Historical Society, as it was being formed or more, developed, actually, I think created a census of monuments. I believe I ran across it when prepping for this class, although we never used it. Who wants to take the interpretation question?
I would love to
Okay.
jump in.
Carolyn,
There's an amendment process for historic properties. You can amend recognition for a site, and actually the theme study created by the National Park Service, one of the chapters talks about property amendment. So there's a huge emphasis. That's one of the goals of the Heritage Initiative, is to help amend properties that have an LGBTQ connection, but maybe it's not currently being reflected at the site. So that represents a really easy way where estimates say that could be a couple dozen, that could be a couple hundred sites that could be amended. And in the National Park Service work, they have a list of, I think, 5 or 10 different sites that would be great candidates for that amendment process. But something else that the National Park Service has also done as part of their work with the LGBTQ Heritage Initiative is really rely on crowdsourced initiative. So in 2012, in experimenting with a Google map where people could add sites, within a couple days, they had I think a couple hundred or couple thousand submissions of LGBTQ properties. And so now through a partnership with HistoryPin, what different communities can do, or even different individuals, is upload sites in that digital mapping technology. And so across the United States, then you can see these collections that are being added. And what's very cool, and I'm sure others can speak to this as well about those digital projects, is that if you see a monument, right, so even if you're walking by the 307 plaque, right, it says safe spaces. It doesn't really talk a lot about the location's history as with drag performers or even as a gay bar. That imagery is pretty minimized in the plaque itself. But then if you're able to look up on a digital platform and read more about the performers, all of a sudden that enriches the space. And I think that's also very useful for maybe spaces that have more difficult histories to navigate, is it gives you an opportunity to, even if you can't figure out how to change something in that landscape or on that monument, to supplement it. So all of a sudden you're having a much richer conversation. And so there are so many different projects that the National Park Service or even that universities are working with to help expand the way that we interact with complex monuments that allow us to change them and allow us to grow with those monuments. And I think that that's very cool and represents a really exciting opportunity for a lot of reasons.
Hey, so I think that's brilliant last word, because we've had a great crowd with great questions and lots of enthusiasm. So the idea, that kind of notion of crowdsourcing is a fabulous way. Jim McPherson asked that earlier. It's an important question. Maybe it's something we can figure out as an outcome from this meeting. But Janie, you get the final word as always.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming to tonight's program, and a reminder that this discussion will be available in the Journal of Arizona History next summer, so keep an eye out for that. Consider becoming a member to get yourself a hard copy of the Journal of Arizona History. This is usually the part of the night where I tell people to drive home safe, but it looks like I'm the only one who has to drive. I'm still in the museum right now. So take care, and maybe next time you walk past a statue, read the plaque.
Great advice, Janie. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Good night,
Dr.
everyone.
Tebeau. Thank you all. It was awesome presenting with you. Be safe, everybody.
Good night.
Great. Good night. Hey, nice seeing you all.
Good night. Thank you.
Good semester,
Thanks,
Aaron.
everyone. That was great.
Yeah, thank you.
Mark,
Yeah.
Could you possibly save the chat and
Yep, I've recorded it, so it all